Hi again. Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the Swedish winning streak came to a dramatic end. The whole Swedish army was destroyed in a few hours in July 1709. The soldiers who weren't killed on the field north of Poltava were taken prisoner. Few of them ever regained their freedom. In other words, overnight the Swedish Empire became more or less defenseless. It didn't take long for Sweden's many enemies to smell the blood in the water and to do what they could to exploit this weakness. Denmark made another attempt at retaking Scania, but failed. Tsar Peter the Great was more successful. The Russians conquered all of Sweden's Baltic provinces, Ingria, Livonia, Kurland, and Estonia. Then they continued to invade Finland itself, subjecting the inhabitants to a harsh occupation, including robbery, rape, murder, and general destruction. Meanwhile, the King of Sweden had narrowly escaped capture after the catastrophic defeat at Poltava. Today, we'll check in with Karl XII and see what he was up to while the Danes were invading Scania and the Russians desolated Finland. Episode 104, Long Distance Rule. When Tsar Peter understood that the King of Sweden and his retinue had escaped across the river Dnieper before the Swedish army surrendered, he sent out a force to chase them. He wanted to capture Karl XII and finish the war and the Swedish Empire once and for all. It took 5 days, but as the Swedes were crossing yet another river, this time the southern Bug, the Russians caught up with them. Some 600 Swedes and Cossacks were stuck on the wrong side of the river and fell into Russian captivity. But the king and some 1,500 soldiers managed to get away yet again. Soon thereafter, they crossed the border into the Ottoman Empire. Here, they were safe, at least from the Russians, and that was their primary concern at the moment. The day after, Karl XII met with Yusuf Pasha, the local representative of Sultan Ahmed III. The King of Sweden was received with great honor, and the Pasha granted his request for asylum in the Ottoman Empire. But he rejected King Karl's request to settle in the little town of Bender in present-day Moldova. Apparently, the Sultan felt it would be too provoking to the Russians to let the Swedish refugees stay in the town. Instead, they had to set up camp in a more discreet place, out of sight. The king agreed. What choice did he have? And established a camp that with time would develop into something of a small town of its own, even though it didn't really live up to its rather grandiose name, Karlopolis. Only a few weeks after the escape, the elderly Cossack leader Ivan Mazepa passed away. Of course, it was sad for Karl XII that his trusted ally died, but there was a silver lining. The King of Sweden received a large loan from Mazepa's fortune after his death, and let me tell you, the money came in handy. You see, the Swedes were in a bit of a bind money-wise, since most of the Swedish war chest had been lost to the Russians, and Karl XII was in desperate need for funds to pay for various gifts and bribes in order to create and strengthen useful connections. The money from Mazepa's estate was welcome, but didn't last very long. The Sultan also granted the king 2 loans of a combined sum of $900,000, in addition to daily deliveries of food and other supplies. That still wasn't enough, so Karl XII had to borrow even more money from various bankers and private individuals. Since he just borrowed more and more money without paying any back, the king's credit score suffered. As a consequence, the interest on these loans rose steeply. All in all, the king accumulated debts of about $2.5 million, which was the equivalent of half the crown's annual income. Karl XII would end up staying in the Ottoman Empire for several years. But during this extended stay as a guest of the Sultan, he was still the King of Sweden with absolute power, and he didn't want to give any of the power up, or to delegate to someone else who was actually present in the capital and not 1,800 kilometers away. This made governing Sweden tricky and rather inefficient, since it could take a courier anything from 3 to 12 months to travel between Karlopolis and Stockholm. And it wasn't just state secrets that had to be sent across miles and miles of enemy territory. Every decision, even the appointment of the lowliest bureaucrat had to be approved by the king, which meant an automatic delay of at least 6 months. Meanwhile, Karlopolis developed into a small town. There was a sizable building for the royal administration, large kitchens, various storage facilities, 2 stables with rooms for hundreds of horses, the king's treasury, a building I'm guessing didn't have to be all that large, houses for the officers, and several dozens of huts where 400 of the king's soldiers were housed. In the middle of it all stood the so-called King's House. It was a stone building with 2 floors, 100 steps long and 50 steps wide, based on the king's own design. On the second floor there was a balcony from which sermons were delivered no fewer than 3 times a day. Remember that Sweden was a seriously pious society at the time. In addition to all these sermons, the balcony was also used by trumpeters and drummers announcing the king's meals for some reason. So you may ask yourselves, if the Steinbender was so expensive and created such an administrative headache, making it unnecessarily complicated to govern Sweden, why didn't the king just go home? Why insist on having a whole town built and even designing his own residence in it? The main reason was that Karl XII hoped that he'd be able to convince the Sultan to declare war on Russia, forcing the Tsar to move his focus away from Sweden to his southern front instead. That, the king figured, would give him a fighting chance to reclaim his Baltic Empire again, and, who knows, maybe even enable him to march on Moscow and topple Peter the Great after all. The king's plan was for a 2-pronged attack. The Ottomans would invade Russia from the south, at the same time as the Swedes would attack from the west. Tsar Peter would be defeated, and the king would once again be able to force Augustus II to abdicate in Poland. The Ottomans didn't reject the idea, but they had interests of their own. Their primary goal was to use the presence of Karl XII in Bender to put pressure on the Russians, but they would prefer not to go to war, and the restoration of the Swedish Empire was far down the list of the Sultan's priorities. And this tactic worked. The Russians clearly were nervous about what the Swedish king may convince the Sultan to do, and in March 1710 they extended the Russo-Ottoman peace treaty from 1700. Most people who'd get that piece of news would probably throw up the hands, admit defeat, cut their losses, and just go home. But Karl XII wasn't most people. Instead, the outraged king insisted that the Ottomans break the treaty and go to war against the Russians. And it worked. Sort of. The king's tenacity, in combination with some court machinations in Constantinople, saw the Grand Vizier ousted a few months later. He was replaced with a guy who was far more interested in Swedish suggestions and, just maybe, Swedish gifts. This new Grand Vizier actually managed to convince the Sultan to declare war on Russia, which he did in November. That meant that Tsar Peter had to raise an army and send it south, which he did in the spring of 1711. No fewer than 48,000 Russian soldiers were sent to invade the Ottoman Empire instead of Finland. Karl XII was offered to join the Ottoman counteroffensive, but he declined because he wasn't given the command of a large enough force. He felt strongly that as a king, he should command a whole army, nothing less. So that summer, the Grand Vizier took his 100,000 soldiers and marched against the Russians without assistance from the King of Sweden. After a short campaign, the Ottomans surrounded the Russian army at the river Prut on July 9th. That is almost 2 years to the day after the Battle of Poltava. Seeing that his situation was hopeless, the Tsar asked for a 2-day truce to negotiate. The Russian defeat was just what Karl XII had hoped for, but it took some time for this news to reach the King of Sweden. But when he did hear about it, I bet he kicked himself for not accepting that minor command in the Ottoman army. If he had, he'd already be present at the negotiations. As things stood now, the Swedish king jumped on a horse and rode as fast as he could to Prut to convince the Ottomans to steer the negotiations in a direction that would be advantageous to the Swedes. But he didn't make it on time. Already on July 11th, the day before the king even heard about the negotiations, the Ottomans and the Russians had reached another agreement. The Tsar had been treated leniently and was allowed to march his army back home again in exchange for a list of concessions. The only concession that had anything to do with Sweden was that the Russians promised not to hinder Karl XII from going back home, clearly revealing what the Ottomans wanted the Swedes to do. When he finally arrived, Karl XII and the Grand Vizier had what diplomats like to call a frank exchange of opinions. Karl XII was so angry and disappointed that he actually agreed to return to Sweden on condition that the Ottomans would provide him with an escort of 80,000 soldiers. The Grand Vizier could only offer 8,000, so in the end the king chose to stay put in Karlopolis. And maybe that had been the right move, because a few months later the king's hopes for a war were rekindled. Tsar Peter didn't fulfill his obligations stipulated in the agreement, blaming it on the Ottomans still not having evicted the Swedes. At first, the Grand Vizier tried to convince Karl XII to just leave already, bumping up the offered escort to 12,000 men, but the king refused to budge. The Sultan then declared war on the Russians again to make them stick to the agreement from Prut. But this never really led to any serious fighting. Instead, a new peace deal was signed in Constantinople in April 1712. But later that year, Karl XII's emotional roller coaster took another twist when Ahmed III once again declared war on Russia. That's the third declaration of war since Karl XII settled in Bender, for those of you keeping score at home. To really show the Sultan that Sweden was doing its part in this war, the king gave the war hero Magnus Stenbock the authority to organize setting up a new Swedish army in Pomerania. Already in mid-September, before the Sultan had even declared war for the third time, Stenbock had an army of 14,000 men ready. This impressed both the king and, perhaps more importantly, the Sultan. But then Stenbock ruined the favorable first impression by not marching east and instead initiating peace negotiations with Augustus II. The Sultan drew the conclusion that if the Swedes were going to be of any use for him in a war against Russia, Karl XII would have to lead the Swedish army personally. And for that to happen, he needed to get back to Sweden as soon as possible. This realization, in combination with the increasingly expensive hospitality, led the Sultan to conclude that there was no other choice than to evict the King of Sweden, by force if need be. But when Karl XII was asked to leave, he refused. Even in the face of the numerically superior Ottoman forces, the king continued to refuse. He was convinced that they would never dare to actually use force against him, a crowned head of a friendly kingdom. But whatever the king thought, the Ottomans started to take concrete steps to vacate Karlopolis. In January 1713, the Pasha, who actually liked the Swedes, let the king know that he had orders to throw the Swedes out if they didn't agree to leave. The king took this news seriously enough to order all Swedes in the area to return to Karlopolis. The soldiers were instructed to dig ditches and to build barricades. On January 15th, the first Ottoman troops arrived, and 2 days later they initiated a siege. As the noose around the Swedish camp was tightening, the king himself made a habit of inspecting the Ottoman positions on a daily basis, together with a large group of officers. The Ottoman soldiers had strict orders not to disturb or hinder the king, and Karl XII exploited this order to the max. He would also send soldiers on raids to collect provisions in the area. For the king, it was a way to uphold his honor and to show that he wasn't afraid of the Ottomans. Toward the end of January, King Karl received notice that the Sultan really meant business and that the evacuation of Karlopolis was imminent. But Karl XII brushed this news aside as baseless gossip. He was still convinced that as long as he stayed firm and didn't show weakness or fear, he'd soon be invited to join yet another anti-Russian alliance. Turned out he was wrong, because at around 10 o'clock in the morning on January 31st, the Pasha showed up outside Karlopolis in the company of a few thousand Janissaries. They'd also brought cannons along. When the Swedes answered by playing military marches from the balcony of the king's house, the Ottomans opened fire. A Swedish trumpeter was killed. He was the first victim, but he wouldn't be the last. That first salvo triggered intense activity inside the king's house. Perhaps Karl XII finally let it sink in that there would be an attack, because he gathered his officers, priests and senior administrators and showed them letters supposedly proving that the Ottomans planned to hand him over to Augustus II. That meant he couldn't surrender, and they all needed to fight to the end to save their king from such a humiliating fate. The king didn't convince everyone, though, and a bunch of Swedes chose to sneak out of Karlopolis and hand themselves over to the Ottomans. Those who chose to stay redoubled their efforts to beef up the barricades and prepare for the coming assault. But no assault came. Turns out that after that first salvo, the Janissaries pleaded with the Pasha to abort the mission. They regarded the Swedes as their comrades and allies and refused to hurt them. The Pasha feared that he'd lose control over the situation and decided to withdraw his troops back to Bender, away from the action. But he had no intention of actually cancelling the attack. Once the Janissaries had been brought back to Bender, the Pasha executed 30 of the most vocal ones in order to restore his own authority. The following morning, February 1st, he returned to Karlopolis at the head of a new force, consisting mostly of soldiers who hadn't been fraternizing with the Swedes and some who had witnessed the executions the day before. Now some 17,000 Ottoman soldiers surrounded the Swedish camp. Clearly, the Pasha wasn't a less is more kind of guy. At this point, a group of about 50 Janissary officers approached Karlopolis in a final attempt to convince the king to just throw in the towel before more people were hurt. They swore they'd escort him personally and guard him with their lives. But Karl XII rejected also this offer, even going as far as to threaten to shoot the Janissaries in the beard if they dared to approach the Swedish positions again. This insult enraged the Janissaries, who had made this last-ditch effort to save King Karl from himself. They called him Demirbaş, which I'm told is Turkish for Ironhead, for his inability to understand the predicament he was in. Now, a full-scale attack on Karlopolis was inevitable, and it started at around noon. The Swedes were busy with one of their daily services, and when they heard the Turkish military music signaling the start of the attack, they ignored it until the priest was done. It's unclear if that was a sign of piety, bravado, or defeatism, or perhaps a combination. The Ottomans opened fire with their artillery, but since they didn't want to kill the king by accident, they hadn't loaded the cannons to maximum capacity. That meant that the stone walls of the king's house only sustained minor damage. When he was done with his prayers, Karl XII did what he always did in situations like these. He threw himself into the thick of things, riding back and forth in Karlopolis to encourage his dejected soldiers to rally and fight to the glorious end. Nonetheless, hundreds of Swedish soldiers chose to throw down their weapons as soon as the Ottomans broke through the barricades and started to stream into the camp. Only a few dozen loyal soldiers kept up the fight and withdrew into the king's house together with King Karl. The withdrawal became dramatic because Ottoman soldiers, encouraged by a promise of a reward to whoever managed to capture the King of Sweden, threw themselves at Karl XII as he was retreating. He did so very slowly, probably trying to make some point about not being afraid or wanting to save his dignity. But the result was that a bunch of soldiers caught up with him and started to pull at his clothes. The king had to try and beat them off in a way that can't be said to have been too dignified. The situation then escalated when someone fired a gun, which singed the king's eyebrows. In the end, a group of Swedish soldiers managed to fight off the Ottomans and help the king into the temporary safety of the king's house before the doors were slammed shut and barred. Somewhere between 40 and 60 Swedes were now trapped inside the king's house. Not all of them were soldiers either. Some were just civilian bureaucrats or servants. The king divided his remaining soldiers into small groups. Each group was tasked with barricading rooms and guarding the windows, shooting at anyone who tried to enter. Despite intense effort to force their way in, the Ottomans failed, and many of them died trying. They were in a frustrating situation because even though they outnumbered the Swedes approximately 300 to 1, there were only so many soldiers who could try and get through a window at a time. And since they couldn't risk killing the king, they couldn't just raze the building to the ground. Around 4 or 5 in the afternoon, the Pasha decided he wasn't going to waste any more soldiers this way. It was time to change tactics. if he couldn't send the soldiers in, he'd make the Swedes come out by burning the house down. As the day was fading, the Ottomans started to pile up hay bales along the walls of the king's house, setting them on fire. This had only a limited effect, though, and it wasn't until they started shooting burning arrows onto the wooden roof that the fire really got going. When the Swedes inside realized the roof was on fire, they hurried up to the attic and tried to put it out. The problem was that they didn't have much water, definitely not enough to put out a fire. In their desperation, the Swedes filled their hats with wine and vodka, of which they had an ample supply, and tried to pour it onto the flames. They quickly learned that alcohol isn't the ideal liquid to drown a fire with. Soon they had to retreat downstairs to the king's bedchamber, while coughing and trying to extinguish the fire in their clothes. By now, the situation was clearly hopeless. The top floor of the building was a raging inferno, and the remaining defenders had a rapidly dwindling supply of water, food, and ammunition. One of the king's aides asked for the soldiers to be allowed to capitulate and save their lives. At first, Karl XII rejected the idea and insisted that they stay and fight to the death in order to achieve immortality in the memory of their compatriots. But when the roof started to cave in, even the brave king began to reconsider the benefits of finding a way out. He wasn't ready to capitulate, though. Instead, his plan was to carry out a strategic retreat and take up position in another nearby stone building that was still intact. The Swedes made a run for it, and the king led the small group of loyal followers who were still alive out through the door. When the Ottomans saw the Swedes running, they started to chase after them. Coming around the corner of the burning building, King Karl accidentally tripped on his own spurs and fell on his face on the ground. Before he had time to get up, back on his feet, a swarm of Ottoman soldiers were piling onto him, trying to claim the honor of having apprehended the King of Sweden, and the reward that went with it. Even though he tried, the king had no chance of fighting them all. In the end, he had to give up. As soon as the other Swedes saw that Karl XII had stopped resisting, they immediately capitulated to put an end to the whole affair. By now, it was about 8 o'clock in the evening. Somewhere between 12 and 31 Swedes lost their lives in the intermezzo that gave the Swedish language one of its few Turkish loanwords, kalabalik, which is still used in Swedish today, meaning chaos or a melee. We don't know for sure how many Ottomans died. Naturally, Swedish sources have tried to inflate their number as much as possible, but even the Pasha claimed that he lost more than 200 men that day. Quite a few people were also wounded. Many Swedes suffered from burns, some quite serious. Beyond his singed eyebrows, the king himself also had a deep cut on his left hand between his thumb and his forefinger, where he had parried an Ottoman saber. He had also broken 2 bones in his right foot at the very end when he fell and ended up beneath a pile of Ottoman soldiers. When things calmed down, Karl XII was brought to the Pasha's residence in Bender. He was placed under house arrest, but treated with the utmost respect by the Ottomans, who didn't want to cause any further offense or unnecessary drama. But it was different for the other Swedes. After the capitulation, many of them were roughed up, and they were all robbed of whatever money and other possessions they were still carrying with them. Several of them had to pay ransom to be released. Some were helped by the king, who bought their freedom, whereas others had to take loans from local Greek and Armenian moneylenders to be allowed to leave. So the deed was finally done. Karlopolis was vacated, the King of Sweden was under house arrest, and would be sent packing. But if you think that's the end of the whole bizarre affair, you'd be wrong. There's a twist, you see. In the last days of January, Sultan Ahmed III received news that General Steinbock had actually won a major victory against a combined Danish-Saxon army on December 9th. This convinced the Sultan that the Swedes actually still had an army in the field in Pomerania that was capable of getting things done, so he sent new orders to the Pasha in Bender on January 26th, forbidding him from using force against the Swedes. Unfortunately for everyone involved, those new orders only arrived the day after the Kalabalik had taken place. When he learned of the storming of Karlopolis, Ahmed III fired both the Grand Vizier and the Pasha in Bender, even though they had only carried out the Sultan's own original orders. Karl XII was released, and his agents and diplomats in Constantinople resumed their efforts to get the Ottoman leadership to agree to yet another war against Russia. But nothing came of it. Soon thereafter, Ahmed III changed his mind. Again. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended later that spring, the Sultan started to worry that the Holy Roman Emperor would now have resources to attack the Ottomans, so he didn't want to risk going to war with Russia under those circumstances. Karl XII was finally forced to admit to himself that he wouldn't be able to get the Sultan to attack Russia. Besides, he really needed to get home. Governing long distance was complicated, and he had been reached by worrying news from Stockholm. The council was begging him to return. Things were getting desperate back home. King Karl may have been worried about the complaints, but he became really upset when he heard that the council had let his sister, Ulrika Eleonora, the only living adult descendant of Karl XI, who was actually present in the country, participate in the decision-making process in his absence. A woman making political decisions. That went against the king's worldview on so many levels, both socially and religiously. It was too outrageous to even contemplate, even if the woman in question was a princess. So, in the morning of September 20th, 1714, Karl XII finally set off on the long journey back home to Sweden. He was traveling with a retinue of 130 Swedes, and they were escorted by Ottoman troops. At the last meeting with the representatives of the Sultan, he was showered with parting gifts, and he thanked them profusely for their hospitality. At the border to the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman soldiers left them, and the Swedes continued on alone. Well, not completely alone. The king hadn't been able to settle all his debts before leaving Bender, so to make sure they'd get their money back, 29 Ottomans who'd loaned money to Karl XII and their families and servants had also decided to accompany the king back to Sweden. Before crossing the border, Karl XII had secured an agreement with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI that he'd be traveling incognito through the Holy Roman Empire. King Karl still worried he might be abducted by agents from Poland, Saxony or Russia if he was recognized. The emperor was happy to grant this request, since he was worried that Protestants in his empire might be inspired to rebel if the king of the fiercely Protestant Sweden suddenly showed up. After all, it had happened before. To ensure that he wouldn't be recognized, the king left the large retinue behind. Instead, he traveled with only 2 companions. It is much easier to travel incognito under a false name in a group of 3 instead of a group of a few hundred. Still, it wasn't a completely risk-free operation. It wasn't exactly a secret that the King of Sweden had finally left the Ottoman Empire and was on his way back home. To further confuse any agents who were out to get the king, another small group of Swedes set off after King Karl and his companions. One of the men in that second group actually dressed like the king and was supposed to impersonate him, drawing the attention of hostile agents. The king and his 2 companions set off in the evening of October 27th, hoping to depart unobserved. They rode quickly and with only few and short breaks. They reached Vienna on November 5th, where they switched horses and continued along the river Danube before turning north. It didn't take long for word to get out that the King of Sweden was supposed to be traveling through the Holy Roman Empire, and every city, town and village was abuzz with rumors. Still, almost no one recognized the king. The story goes that someone challenged the king only once, accusing him of being Karl XII. The king then raised a glass of wine and drained it, proving that he couldn't possibly be the King of Sweden, since it was widely known that the king didn't touch alcohol. The king and his companions traveled on via Hanover and Mecklenburg, and at 2 o'clock at night on November 11th, they eventually reached the Swedish-held town of Stralsund in Pomerania. Or at least they reached the city gates. The guard refused to open and let the 3 strangers enter the city in the middle of the night. The 3 travelers had to wait for 2 hours out in the dark before the guard was convinced to unlock the gate for them. Karl XII was finally back on Swedish soil, or at least on soil controlled by Sweden. He and his 2 companions had traveled 2,152 kilometers in a fortnight, which means they had traveled more than 150 kilometers every single day. That's quite an accomplishment. The rest of the retinue from Bender didn't reach Pomerania until March the following year. The news of the king's arrival in Stralsund spread like wildfire throughout Europe. In Stockholm, the news was met with jubilation, and the relieved council expected the king to return to the capital as soon as possible to resume his duties there. But Karl XII had other plans. Tune in next time to learn what he was up to. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.